Ancient Egypt, 4000 to 1800 BC. Ancient Egypt was surrounded by deserts, but it was green and fertile because of the Nile River. It flooded every year, depositing rich, silty soil along its banks. The Egyptians used the Nile for transportation and cultivated the land alongside it. They grew wheat and barley for bread and beer, and flax for linen. They raised cattle as beasts of burden. Egyptians had a highly developed religion and advanced medical, astronomical, and engineering knowledge. The Egyptians loved to wear lucky charms. Their favorite charms were carved stone scarabs. The scarab beetle was sacred to their sun god Ra. The Pharaohs. For most of their history, Egyptians were unified in one kingdom. Administrators and priests ran everyday affairs, but the head of society was the pharaoh, a living god. People believed that ceremonies he performed kept the goodwill of the people and the gods, and kept the Nile flowing, and kept society in order. When the pharaoh died, his body was mummified, and placed his body in stone sarcophagi in an imposing tomb, along with jewelry, clothing, furniture, and food, everything he would need for eternity. Sacred writings on the tomb walls were meant to protect him in the afterlife. Pyramids. From around 2630 BC, Egyptians built many pyramids, the most famous being the Great Pyramid at Giza. No one knows exactly why the shape was chosen, but the scale and dimensions suggest astronomical, mathematical, and spiritual purposes. By building such great monuments, the pharaohs sought to please the gods and give a significant permanent mark on history. Some of the stone blocks above the king's chamber weighed 60 tons, and about 2.3 million of them were used. Pyramid building involved immense skill. The largest, the Great Pyramid at Giza, may have taken over 30 years to build. The Great Pyramid, the first of the three pyramids at Giza, and the tomb of the pharaoh Khufu had many passageways and chambers. Egyptian civilization hugged the Nile River. The floodplains of the delta were rich and highly populated. Though cities stretched a long way up the Nile, riverboat transportation was important to traders. Egyptian society. Most people in Egypt were farmers. They gave part of their produce to the local temple as taxes. Very few people could read and write, and schooling was only for boys. Those who could read and write were called scribes. It was they who went on to become priests and administrators, who ran the country for the pharaoh. But at the heart of Egyptian life was communication with the gods. The funeral rites of Egyptian pharaohs were elaborate. A pharaoh's procession could reach the Absur at the Nile River in 2450 BC. The procession would enter the valley temple, and the embalmed body would be carried up a causeway to the pyramid. Towards the end, the Egyptians created remarkable works of stone carving. They built enormous pyramids and temples. Tall obelisks were cut from block of stone. No effort or expense was spared to honor the gods or the pharaoh, who was their living link with humanity. The Egyptians developed a way to preserve the body of their god king, and many building projects were undertaken to provide him with a tomb for his eternal protection. In time, everyone who could afford it would have their preserved bodies placed in tombs, with treasures for the afterlife and sacred skulls to guide them on it. Return to greatness. After the time of the first pharaohs and the pyramid builders, there was a decline that lasted for over 100 years. With no strong ruler, the people felt the gods had abandoned them. Then, around 2040, Mentuhotep became pharaoh, brought order, and restored Egypt's greatness. This period is called the Middle Kingdom. The pharaohs reorganized the country, and again built pyramids, though not as large as those at Giza. Some of Egypt's finest art and literature was produced during the Middle Kingdom. Egypt had been isolated from the rest of the world at the time. Ancient Egyptians were not great travelers, sailors, or conquerors, but great Middle Kingdom rulers as of Amenemhat I and Senusret III expanded Egypt's boundaries. They built forts to protect the country and created a strong army. They invaded countries such as Nubia to gain control of gold reserves. So, a couple other interesting objects. Some key dates about the Egyptians in 3300 BC. Growth of towns and rivers in the Nile Valley and development of hieroglyphics. 3000 BC, Upper and Lower Egypt are united under a single pharaoh. 2920 is the first pharaohs. 2575, you have the Old Kingdom. The capital is Memphis, the high point of Egyptian civilization. 2550, you have the Great Pyramid completed. 2040, the Middle Kingdom expansion and development. And 1550, the New Kingdom, Egypt at its largest and wealthiest. Some of the Egyptian gods include Horus, the sky god, and his spirit entered the living pharaoh. His eyes were the sun and the moon. Ptah, the creator god, invented arts and was the local god of the capital Memphis. Hathor, the goddess of love and beauty, once raised the sun up to heaven on her horns. Isis, the sister and wife of Osiris, was the mother of Horus. She had great magical powers. Re-Horakti, the sun god, and Horus joined together, is known the sun on the hawk's head. Osiris was the god of the dead. In his realm, souls were judged for their worthiness. Sumer and Akkad, 5000 to 1600 BC. The first people to settle in Mesopotamia were the Sumerians more than 7,000 years ago. They built a number of independent city-states, the first civilization. The Sumerian civilization consisted of a number of city-states, cities that were also independent nations. Some of these cities lasted for 3,000 years. They were located on important trade routes along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their traders traveled to Egypt and India. Sumerian cities. Each city-state had fine public buildings, markets, workshops, and water systems. There was a royal palace and a ziggurat, on top of which was a shrine dedicated to the god of that city. Around the public buildings were houses. Beyond these lay the farmers' fields and the marshlands of the Mesopotamian rivers. Reading and writing. The Sumerians devised one of the earliest writing systems, cuneiform. From about 3200 BC they wrote on clay tablets, and scribes and held a key role in society. Thousands of tablets have survived, containing accounts, records, sacred scripts, and letters. The contents of their graves have shown that the Sumerians were wealthy and their craftspeople skilled. Scribes and accountants were important and involved in all aspects of Sumerian daily life, including trade, law, and religion. Sargon of Akkad invaded Mesopotamia, carving out the world's first empire. The fertile Tigris and Euphrates rivers acted as the birthplace of trading cities, extending their influence far and wide, an attractive target for marauding warriors. Internal strife. Around 2900 BC, with city populations growing, power shifted away from the priesthoods, which had been all-powerful. Commerce gradually became more important than religion. Rivalry between different cities grew, and they fought each other for supremacy. They were also invaded by tribes from Persia, Arabia, and Turkey, who wanted to share the city's wealth and power. Akkad and Ur. Eventually, the city of Akkad grew dominant. The city was left by Sargon, who created the world's first empire around 2334 BC. His rule brought order, but it also brought cruelty and violence. Around 2100 BC, as Akkad declined, the city of Ur took its place, rising to prominence for a century after its fall. Assyria and Babylon grew to dominate the area afterwards. The Indus Valley, 4000 to 1800 BC. The early peoples of the Indian subcontinent lived on the banks of the Ganges and the Indus rivers. The first civilization sprang up in the Indus Valley, now in Pakistan. The two largest cities of the Indus Valley around 2000 BC were Mohenjo Daro and Harappa, each with around 40,000 people. They were among the world's largest cities at the time. At the center of each lay an artificial mound, which served as a citadel. On this mound stood a large granary, which, to the population, served as a kind of central bank. These forgotten cities were only discovered in the 1920s. City layout. Around the city, the central buildings were arranged in a grid pattern. Administration buildings, market, storage areas, workshops, houses, and temples. Each house was built around a courtyard and had rooms, a toilet, and a well. Buildings were made from mud bricks baked into the wood-fired ovens. The citadel at Mohenjo-daro had a bathhouse, as well as private and public baths and meeting places. Farmers and crafts workers. Among other crops, the farmers of the Indus Valley grew barley, wheat, cotton, melons, and dates. Elephants and water buffalo were tamed to work the fields. The area had many skilled potters, who used wheels for throwing pots, a new technology at the time. Harappans used stone tools and made knives, weapons, bowls, and figures in bronze. They had an advanced system of waste disposal that included the building of covered drains and the installation of garbage chutes. The end of a civilization. No one knows who the people of the Indus Valley were or where they came from. We do not understand their writing either. The area had similarities to Sumer, but also major differences. The city dwellers traded with the cities of Sumer. They also traded with the tribespeople of India and Central Asia. The Indus Valley civilization lasted 800 years, but came to an end around 3,700 years ago. No one knows why it ended, but there are possible causes: floods, disease, a breakdown in trade, the economy, or civil disorder, immigration, or takeover by the Aryans who moved into India from Central Asia. All trace of the cities lay buried under sand until they were rediscovered in the 1920s. The Shang dynasty, 1766 to 1122 BC. The earliest civilizations in China, from about 3200 BC, grew up on the banks of the three largest rivers, the Huanghe, the Changjiang, and the Xijiang. Like the people of Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, Chinese farmers relied on the country's rivers for transportation and water to grow their crops. Paddy fields needed floods in springtime to help the rice grow. But the Chinese also faced two dangers: major floods and the devastating raids by tribes from the north and the west. Early cultures. The first small towns appeared around 3000 BC during the Longshan period, around the Huanghe, otherwise known as the Yellow River, in the north. According to tradition, Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, was the first emperor from around 2700 BC. The first dynasty was that of the Xia, who ruled for 4 centuries from 2200 BC. Yu, its founder, is credited with taming the rivers by building dikes to stop flooding and also irrigation channels. Tang and the Shang. The earliest dynasty we have evidence for was the Shang, founded by Emperor Tang. The Shang ruled North China for more than 600 years. They lived in a string of cities along the Huanghe with a capital at Anyang. The city had many large palaces and temples built mainly of carved wood. The Shao dynasty replaced the Shang in 1122 BC. The Shang people grew millet, wheat, and rice, and also mulberries for feeding silkworms, from which they produced silk. They kept cattle, pigs, sheep, dogs, and chickens, and hunted deer and wild boar. The Shang used horses to draw plows, carriages, and chariots. Early in their history, they used cowrie shells as money, later switching to bronze. They were skilled in working bronze and jade, and made highly decorated practical and religious objects. Chinese writing. Around 1600 BC, the Shang developed the earliest forms of Chinese calligraphy, a pictorial writing in which each letter represents a whole word. The Chinese script we know today evolved from Shang writing. The Shang worshipped their ancestors, who were seen as wise guides for their way of life, and used oracles to help them make decisions. Bronze. Bronze is a mixture of copper and tin, which when polished looks like gold. The Shang became strong through their bronze working, since it was a hard metal with many uses in tools, household items, and weapons. Bronze was also used for adornments, artistic, and religious items. It was cast in clay molds carved with patterns. Across the world, bronze represented a technological breakthrough.